Howdy, my name is Estrama, and welcome back to the Cosmic Chaos, or if you're new here, welcome. Today's video is going to be different as I'm going to be taking a stab at a tutorial, and as the Twisted Wonderland brain rot is still intermingling with my Kingdom Hearts spine rot, I figured that would be the theme of today's video. You saw the title, we're going to be learning how to make the Twisted Wonderland Chibi sprites, so grab your tablets, pens, or pencils, and let's get started. While the Chibi sprites may seem pretty easy to replicate, it is super important to break down the various elements of what makes this style work. But I do have a tip for all of you. Use red lines, aka redlining. But Astro, what is redlining, you may be wondering? Redlining in this instance is the practice of tracing over the proportions in a piece to study them. But hold, I mentioned tracing! Okay, I'm gonna be honest with y'all, that's gonna be a video for another day. But for this instance, we're going to be using tracing for studying purposes. You can see here that I have gone ahead and traced the proportions of the Chibi sprites of 4 characters. Something to note is that I chose sprites that show off their neutral positions. This is commonly seen in between the music portions of Twisttoons. However, I will touch on posing more in another section. I have decided to redline and break down the proportions of Riddle Rosehearts, Leona Kingscholar, Lilia Vanrouge, and Malleus Draconia for variety. The Chibis are roughly 3 heads tall, their torso is slightly long, and there is little in the way of variety in the simple style, in terms of body shape. Now, there is a reason why I chose Leona, Lilia, and Malleus for the breakdown. Besides humans, there are 2 other races, Beastmen and Fae. A Beastman typically has the ears and tail of an animal, and Fae, well, they have pointed ears, obviously. For Leona, because he is based off of Scar, a lion, his ears are on the top of his head. When I broke down his proportions, he lacks the human ears, where they should be placed. Now, there are NPCs in battles that have animal ears where their human ears would be, so I went ahead and made a note of that. Leona's tail is skinny, but if you were to look at Jack's sprite, his tail is very floofy. Just be sure to keep your character's tail in mind for this one, if your character has a tail, that is. Now for Lilia and Malleus, they have human proportions, however, they have pointed ears. Duh. It's simple, just point the ears and you're good to go. But what about the horns? Simple, they do follow a similar rule to the animal ears Leona, Jack, and Reki have, but if your character has horns closer to their ears, simply move it down closer to the ears and you should be good to go. Feel free to screenshot this image to keep as your guide, and with enough time, patience, and practice, you can easily sketch out the proportions with ease. Side note, Twisted Wonderland is primarily a male-dominated story, but if you have a female MC insert, I went ahead and made something to go off of based on what is established in terms of design conventions. So now that we got the scariest part of making these sprites done, we can now break down other aspects, starting with the face and hair. I decided to go ahead and combine these two as there's one key thing I want all of you to keep in mind. Simplification. What I mean is that compared to the more complicated sprites that are always found in the main story sections, the Chibis are broken down to simple shapes and shading is minimal. We'll start with the eyes and then move on to breaking down the hair. For the eyes, 2 colors are most commonly used, the top color being a dark color, either similar to their hair color or closer to their eye color, and the bottom color being their regular eye color. Silver is an exception to this rule, as he has purple eyes with a blue color towards the bottom of the iris. Every character sprite has diamond pupils. This includes both Grim and Crowley. Something you will notice about each sprite's eyes is that they are very simplified versions of the main sprite's eye shapes. What I mean by that is that the eyes in the Chibi sprites follow the basic shape of the character's eyes. For example, Apple has rounded eyes, the shape is thus broken down and translated into the Chibi sprite by using rounder shapes. Another example would be Jamil's eyes. In his main sprite he has hooded eyes, which again is simplified in the Chibi style to look more hooded and, well, less rendered. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that the eyes in the Chibi sprites follow the basic shapes of the main sprites found in the game. Wait, Astro, what if I have a style that isn't like Twisted Wonderland style? Well, my dear viewer, here is my next tip that I have been repeating through this whole section. Break down the shapes to simplify them. I'll be using my own Twisted Wonderland OC, Lucian. He has big, nervous eyes with 2 little things on his lower eyelids. When simplifying his eye shape, I started with the top lid and followed the line created in his main sprite, quote-unquote. I then added 2 prominent eyelashes, or whatever you want to call them, on either side of the circle. And there we go! Now, something I need you all to know is that this is all covering neutral expressions. The sprites do have surprised, angered, and hurt expressions, for example. For this, I would recommend you not only pay attention to the expressions during lessons, battles, and twist tunes, but also keep your own character's personality in mind. After all, personality can affect how much or how little expression a character can express. I could talk more about this, but that will have to be a video for another day. For now, let's move on to the hair. The hair, which again is simplified, is a little more complicated compared to the eyes, which it depends on the hairstyle. Again, I will be using Lucian as an example. And I'm going to be using an old sprite I made and will be remaking at the end of this video, so stick around. I found that it's easier to work from the back and work my way to the bangs, aka the front. The hair is typically blocked out, and the most rendering is done on the hair alone. So my advice would be this. 1. Don't overcomplicate the hair. No very fine strands, no line work, etc. 2. Work in layers. Layers will be your best friend, but if you are drawing these sprites on something like paper, I would still recommend sketching in the hair seen in the back first and working your way up. Just do be sure to sketch very lightly and just add more depth later on. And lastly, and the third one, keep it lineless. Let the shadows frame the hair and make the impression that there is depth in parts of the hair. I'll be making a little speed paint at the end, which I mentioned earlier, to show you what I mean. Before I move on to the posing, I would like to add that there are diamond-like highlights in the hair. It is always a different color to a character's hair, whether it be by the hue of the same color or just a different color altogether. Again, I will be including the speed paint to show what I mean, but for now, let's move on to the posing. This one will be a bit shorter than the rest, but still important. There are various types of poses: neutral, battle, shock, hurt, win, and lose. These will always pair with expressions, which ties back to the expressions in the previous section. Like with expressions, posing is all about your character's personality. Using Lucian again, he is a very timid and anxious character, but not to the extent of Edia Shroud. This will affect all of his poses. For his neutral pose, he would be a little slouched, his expression uneasy, and he would have his hands in his pockets. For his battle pose, I would imagine that his knees would be closer together, and he'd hold his magic pen with both hands with a very nervous look on his face. For his battle, win, and lose poses, that's very easy to determine. For his win pose, he would still have his timid battle pose, but he'd raise his arm up and have a very shy yet joyous look on his face. For his battle lose pose, he'd relax a little bit, but he'd slouch more and just look defeated. For his shocked pose for classes, specifically flight, he would raise both arms and pose in a cartoonishly nervous way with one leg raised with his knee bent. My best advice for posing is this. Break down the pose and use a skeleton, but also keep your character's personality in mind. If you need help finding poses that best suit your character's personality, do not be afraid of looking up references. They will be your absolute friend for this. Now that we have broken down the poses and different parts of how to construct a sprite, it's time for outfits! These range from fairly simple to overly complicated in the story as well as the events the game has. And then there's designs like the Glorious Masquerade, for example, where they are so overly complicated that I get very scared of drawing them. If you were to take the time to study the sprites, you'll notice that a fair amount of detail has been translated into the sprites. Something that the Chibi sprites have, compared to their more complicated counterparts, is rendering and line art. In fact, most of the time, it's just the base color with nothing extra special. Maybe if there's any metallic bits, there's a hint of a shine, and that's basically it. Look, I'm going to be extremely blunt with you guys. Simplifying the hair, eyes, and body, that's the easy part. It's some of the outfits to simplify that's the hard part. Fortunately, there are two things you can do. One is to boot up the game and take a moment or two to really analyze an outfit. If there's a specific event going on and you want to make an outfit for it, that will be an option available to you. Keep in mind that these are limited. Oh, and speaking of events, sprites of characters that are central to any event will have different objects instead of their magic pens. For example, characters who participated in the Ghost Bride event will have bouquets of roses. All characters who participate in the Culinary Crucibles will have different cooking utensils. And lastly, characters who have participated in the Glorious Masquerade will have their masks as their weapons. By studying these designs, you'll begin to pick up on certain design conventions to give you a foundation to work on. Alternatively, or if you find that you learn best by doing something over watching and listening, once again, Google up some sprites and redline any details that you notice. For studying purposes, trace lines and details to break down various shapes and lines you see in order to learn the design conventions that you can then apply to your own designs. Okay, so unfortunately, I didn't include Overblot in the speed paint that you'll be seeing later on, but I do think that this is super important to address. Overblot. If your character has an Overblot form, then chances are they're going to have a blot monster too. Fortunately, if you got the basics from earlier down, you won't need to worry about the character sprite themselves. Now, it's the blot monster I want to touch on. Each character who's overblotted in the story will have a blot monster, and from what we have seen, they are of the characters the Overblot 7 are twisted from. You'll notice that their heads are replaced with a glass jar full of ink, their colors dull and dark, and they have stitching reminiscent of Frankenstein's monster. And yet, they are simple compared to their overblotted person. If your character is twisted from a character such as, say, Oogie Boogie for example, you would have to dull and darken the colors, and you will likely have to finagle with the glass head shape that would suit the twisted character. Remember, the blot monster behind the overblot victim will be more simple compared to the victim themselves, and the overblot victim, from what we have seen, usually commands the creature. Now, what if you didn't make a character twisted from someone already existing? Well, then that's when you get creative. If your character is, say, a werewolf, you could create a blot monster with a werewolf body and perhaps a crescent moon glass head. If your character's half kraken, same deal. Go nuts if your character isn't twisted from any of Disney's villains. And now we have come to the part you have all been waiting for, putting this all together. I've talked long enough, so I will give your ears a break and show you those steps that I've listed and show you how I put things together. I will come in towards the end to explain things after the sprites are finished. And there we have it. I would have liked to add a pose of him using a spell, a sprite of his Overblot form, and the Overblot monster behind him. However, I wanted to make it so that you could see all of the sprites in one piece. In the future, I'll include the Overblot creature to make up for this. Also, since I'm using Clip Studio Paint, I used multiply layers and use a dark purple to add some sprayed on shading towards the bottom of the legs and sleeves. However, if you're doing this traditionally, then feel free to use either dark grays or darker versions of the colors that you use. And there you have it! Now, there's something I do want to acknowledge, and that's what I just taught you guys is how I would personally create the sprites and how I broke things down to try to figure this style out. However, I do hope that this breakdown helps you in creating your own sprites for your OCs. Now go forth and create your Twist Sprite army! Thank you all so much for watching and listening to me ramble. If you would like, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and I will see you all in the void again real soon. Goodbye!